The Mafia boss destroyed her old bookstore in rage, then learned she saved his father's life. Some women are born into quiet lives. I was born into the kind of quiet that hides things, secrets pressed between the pages of old books, truths swallowed before they could bloom into danger. My name is Serafina Amalfi, Sarah, and the story I'm about to tell you is the one I swore I'd take to my grave. But graves don't keep secrets in this city, not in Chicago's Little Italy, where the cobblestones still remember blood and every shadow has a name. I used to own a bookstore, The Whispering Pages. God, even saying the name now is like pressing a bruise. A crumbling brick building squeezed between a shuttered butcher shop and an alley that smelled of rain and old vendettas. My father had bought it for almost nothing when I was 9 years old, and I'd grown up between those shelves, learning the weight of words, the particular warmth of afternoon light falling across yellowed paper, the way a good sentence could make you forget you had bones. It was mine. Every warped floorboard, every water-stained ceiling tile, every locked cabinet in the back room where I kept the books too rare and too dangerous for the window display. It was the one thing in my life that no one could take from me. I was wrong about that. The night it happened, I was alone in the back room cataloging a first edition Calvino that had come in from an estate sale. The rain was doing what Chicago rain always does in October, falling sideways, filling the gutters, making the whole city sound like it was weeping. I had a half-drunk espresso at my elbow, a wool cardigan that had seen better decades, and absolutely no premonition that the next few hours would turn my entire world to cinders. The door came off its hinges at 2:17 a.m., not knocked, not opened. Off its hinges. I heard it. This massive crack of splitting wood and splintering iron, a sound that hit me in the chest before my mind could translate it, and by the time I ran into the main room, they were already inside. 4 men in black, moving with the practiced silence of people who had done terrible things in many rooms. And behind them, filling the doorway like darkness given a tailor, was a man I had never seen before. But I knew what he was the moment I saw him. Tall, broad-shouldered in a bespoke coat that cost more than my monthly rent. Hair black as wet ink, eyes to match. The kind of dark that doesn't reflect light, it absorbs it. A jaw carved from something colder than marble. And a stillness about him that was more terrifying than any movement could have been, because it was the stillness of a man who has never once in his life had to rush, who has always arrived exactly when he intended to and left exactly what he intended to leave. Ruin, in his case. That was what he left. "Search it," he said. Not loud, not angry, just inevitable. They tore my store apart. I stood in my cardigan and bare feet and watched them pull shelves down. Watched first editions hit the floor, spines cracking, pages fanning open like broken wings. Watched the Calvino I'd been holding get wrenched from my hands by a man who wouldn't have known Calvino from a grocery list. I watched the espresso tip over and bleed across the oak counter. I watched my life get dismantled with the calm efficiency of men following orders. And through all of it, he watched me. Not the search, me. Those obsidian eyes tracked every micro-expression that crossed my face. The flinch when the Calvino hit the floor. The way my jaw tightened when they pulled the locked cabinet apart. The single breath I forced myself to take before I opened my mouth. "You're destroying the wrong woman," I said. My voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. He stepped forward, slowly, the way a predator steps when it has already decided, already committed, and the only thing left is to close the distance. He stopped close enough that I could smell him. Rain, gun oil, and something darker underneath. Expensive cologne that had been overwhelmed by a worse night. His hand came up, long-fingered, scarred across the knuckles. He gripped my chin and tilted my face toward his, and for one suspended, airless moment, we were nothing but two people breathing in the same wreckage. "Women who lie to me," he said softly, "don't get second chances, Kara." Then he reached into his coat pocket and produced a single match. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I stood very still and watched Don Alessio Vesperi, Il Ombra, the shadow, the most feared man in Chicago's underworld, light the match and set my entire world on fire. He walked out without looking back. I stood in the street in my bare feet while the whispering pages burned behind me, and I thought, remember this. Remember exactly what his face looked like. Remember his name. Because one day, if the universe has any architecture at all, any sense of symmetry, any taste for irony, you will see him again. I was right about that. If you're already hooked, a quick subscribe keeps the darkness coming, and trust me, this story is only getting started. 5 months. That's how long I spent becoming someone I didn't recognize. The insurance payout was enough to rent a walk-up apartment above a closed cafe on Ashland Street. 2 rooms, a radiator that screamed at 3 a.m., and windows so thin the winter came inside uninvited. I had saved exactly 31 books from the fire, the ones I'd carried out myself in the minutes before the flames reached the back room. I lined them up along the windowsill like soldiers, evidence that something had survived. I found part-time work at a university library, reshelving, cataloging, doing the invisible labor of preservation that no one notices until it stops. My coworker, Elena Sartori, a broad-shouldered woman from Naples who swore in 3 languages and kept a flask of limoncello in her cardigan pocket, became the closest thing I had to a confessor. She knew what had happened to my store. Most of Little Italy did. What no one knew, what I hadn't told a living soul, was who had done it, or why. I knew why. Marco Benevento, that weasel-faced little informant who'd had a tab running at my store for 2 years, borrowing books he never returned and paying me in information I never asked for. Apparently, the information he'd fed Don Alessio Vesperi was of a different flavor. That I was running a drop point for Carmine Ferrara. That my back room full of hollowed-out classics was Ferrara's private ledger system. It wasn't. It had never been anything of the sort. I was an innocent woman who had the catastrophic misfortune of being used as a pawn in a war between kings, and then blamed for the board. But here's the part that kept me awake. My father, Enzo Amalfi, had died when I was 19. A quiet man, a soft-spoken man, a man who loved books and espresso and evening walks, and who had, for 12 years before my birth, served as a low-level soldier in the Vesperi organization. I had known this the way you know that the house you grew up in has a crack in the foundation. Present, significant, mostly hidden. My father had never hurt anyone. He'd driven cars, made deliveries, stood guard at doors. He'd aged out of the life gracefully, opened the bookstore, married my mother, had me. When he died, it was of a heart attack. Clean, civilian, unremarkable. No blood, no drama, no vendetta. I had spent my entire adult life keeping that clean distance from the world he'd come from. And then that world had come to me anyway, in the form of a man with match-black eyes and a lit match. So I kept my head down. I shelved books. I ate Elena's terrible cooking and drank her limoncello, and let myself pretend, most days, that the anger in my chest was just grief. Manageable grief. The kind that sits in you like sediment, heavy, settled, not going anywhere. Until the morning, a black car idled outside the library. I noticed it on Tuesday. Same car, same position, different driver. Wednesday, same car, same position. No one got out. No one spoke to me. By Thursday, I had started keeping my winter coat on inside, and Elena had started looking at me with the particular expression she reserved for her limoncello, like something needed to be handled, and she wasn't sure she was the right woman for the job. "You're being watched," she said flatly on Thursday evening. "I know. Should I be worried?" I thought about it. I thought about match black eyes and the way his voice had been soft, terrifyingly, intimately soft, when he'd called me Kata. "Probably," I said. The note arrived Friday morning, tucked inside the dust jacket of a returns cart book, a worn copy of Dante's Inferno, which I found either poetic or on the nose, depending on my mood. A single card. Heavy stock, no watermark. 3 words in a handwriting that was sharp and deliberate and gave nothing away. "Come tonight. Alone." There was an address on the back. A street in the Gold Coast. One of those streets where the mansions don't have numbers visible from the road because the people who live there don't expect anyone to be looking for them by accident. I should have thrown it away. I should have called Elena, taken her limoncello, burned the card in her kitchen sink, and started making plans to leave Chicago entirely. Instead, I sat in the library storeroom for 40 minutes with Dante's Inferno in my lap, reading the inscription inside the front cover. An old dedication, faded ink, someone's love note from 1961, and I thought about what my father would have done. He would have gone. Not from fear. He'd never been a fearful man. He would have gone because he believed that the only way to understand the fire was to walk toward it. That's what he always said. That courage wasn't the absence of heat. It was the decision to get close enough to see what was burning. I dressed in black. I went. Comment below. Sarah has every reason to stay away, but she walks toward the fire anyway. Would you have gone? What would you have done in her position? The house was not a house. It was a statement. 4 stories of pale stone on a street where the trees had been planted with the same deliberate precision as everything else in this neighborhood, to signal ownership, to signal permanence, to signal that the people who lived here had been here long enough to watch trees grow. Iron gates manned. Security cameras that didn't bother hiding themselves. A front door that was 14 feet tall and had no knocker, which told me everything I needed to know about how often unexpected guests arrived. A man in a dark suit met me at the gate. He didn't speak. He gestured for my bag, checked it, handed it back, and led me inside with the efficient blankness of someone who had escorted hundreds of people through this door and assigned them all the same level of significance, which was none. Inside was the kind of beautiful that takes your breath and doesn't apologize for it. Marble floors the color of old ivory. High ceilings painted with something that might have been restoration or might have been original. A staircase that curved like a question mark. Flowers that were real, expensive, and slightly dying, which felt appropriate. Art on the walls that I recognized, not prints, the actual paintings, and which made the bookseller's daughter and me want to sit down on the floor and cry. He was waiting in what they probably called a study, though it was larger than my entire apartment. Bookshelves floor to ceiling, full, actually used, not decorative. A desk the size of a small country. 2 chairs angled toward a fireplace that was performing its single function with great commitment, casting orange light over everything and making the room feel simultaneously warmer and more dangerous than it had any right to. He was standing with his back to me when I entered, looking into the fire. He didn't turn around when I closed the door behind me. "You came," he said. "Your note didn't include an RSVP option." He turned then, and for the second time in my life, I stood in a room with Don Alessio Vesperi and cataloged the details of him the way I'd cataloged rare books, with the particular attention you give things that are both valuable and volatile. He was in shirt sleeves tonight. Dark trousers, dark shirt, open at the throat. The bespoke coat was gone. It made him look, paradoxically, more dangerous, stripped of the armor of formality, down to the man himself, which was something quite a lot to contend with. There was something different in his face. Not softness, nothing as simple as that. Something more like weight. Like a man carrying something heavy enough to show in his jaw, his shoulders, the way he looked at me with those obsidian eyes and didn't immediately speak. "You're wondering why I asked you here," he said finally. "I'm wondering why you didn't lead with an apology, but I've adjusted my expectations." Something moved behind his eyes. Not amusement, closer to recognition, like I'd named something he'd thought was invisible. "I burned your store." "You did." "I acted on information that was false," I said. "Fabricated. Fed to you by a man named Marco Benevento who, I suspect, was being paid by Carmine Ferrara to make you see enemies where there were none. You burned the life's work of an innocent woman because you trusted a rat over your own intelligence. So yes, I'm aware that you burned my store. We don't need to have a lengthy discussion about whether it happened." Silence. He looked at me for a long, unreadable moment. Then he crossed to the desk and opened a drawer. He set a photograph on the desk between us. An old man, white-haired, thin, lying in a hospital bed with tubes in his arms and the particular shrunken quality of someone who had once been enormous. "My father," Alessio said. "Vittorio Vesperi. He's dying. He has asked me, repeatedly for the past 3 weeks, to find a woman he describes as the one who kept him alive. He says she worked in a bookstore in Little Italy. That 5 years ago he was shot in an alley behind that bookstore, and she dragged him inside and stitched him closed and disappeared before dawn." I didn't move. "He said she used dental floss and a medical encyclopedia," Alessio continued, watching me with the precision of a man taking inventory. "He said she left a bookmark soaked in his blood on the counter. He said she never told anyone, never asked for anything, never called the police." I remembered that night with the clarity of things that become permanent the moment they happen. The noise from the alley, the old man crumpled against the dumpster, gray-faced, pressing his own coat against his side. My father's voice in my memory. "If you can help someone, you help them. No questions. You help them." "He wants to see her," Alessio said, "before he dies. He wants to say thank you." I met his eyes. "The woman you burned," I said quietly. "That's your bookstore girl." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence entirely. He didn't look away from me. I watched something move through his face, not emotion exactly, or not only emotion. Something structural, like a man whose architecture has just been shown a flaw he hadn't designed for. "Come," he said finally, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier formality. "Meet my father. After, we will discuss what I owe you." He didn't frame it as a request, but it wasn't a threat either. It was something in between. A man asking, in the only language he knew, which was the language of command softened just barely at the edges. I thought of the 31 books on my windowsill, the screaming radiator, the walk-up apartment that smelled of someone else's life. "Lead the way," I said. Vittorio Vesperi's bedroom was at the top of the house, behind a door that 2 men stood guard beside, not because they expected trouble, but because the old Don had always been guarded, and old habits outlive the reasons for them. Inside was quiet in the way that hospital rooms are quiet, a curated stillness, threaded through with the soft sounds of machines, monitors, The antiseptic smell cut with something older. Cedar, old leather, the ghost of tobacco. The man in the bed was small now. That was the first thing. I had remembered him from 5 years ago as large, not tall, but dense, solid, radiating a gravity that the alley had not been able to fully extinguish even when he was bleeding out. Whatever the years and the illness had taken from him, they hadn't taken that quality entirely. Even horizontal, even thin as paper, Vittorio Vesperi had the bearing of a man who had once held a city in his hands. His eyes opened when we entered, and when they found me, those aged, dark eyes, so like his son's and yet somehow warmer, a smile crossed his face with the slow deliberateness of the sun clearing clouds. "There she is," he said, raspy, certain. The girl with the dental floss. I sat in the chair beside his bed, and I took his hand, which was thin now but still had the strength of old muscle memory, and I said, "How's the scar?" He laughed, a real laugh, even if it cost him. "Uglier than the original," he said, "but present, which is the point." I felt Alessio behind me in the doorway, felt him the way you feel a change in weather, not heard, not seen, just known. Vittorio's eyes slid from my face to his son's, and something passed between them. A father's assessment of a son, a very old and very specific communication. "You found her," Vittorio said. "She found herself," Alessio said. I didn't look back at him. Vittorio kept my hand and talked for 40 minutes about the night in the alley, how he'd been careless, how he'd been caught outside his car alone, how the bullet had punched into his side and the man who'd fired it had run rather than finish the job, either too frightened or too inexperienced to understand that leaving a Vesperi breathing was a mistake. About the light in my back window, about dragging himself to the bookstore door. "You didn't ask my name," he said. "I didn't need it. You were bleeding. You could have called an ambulance, called the police. You would have died before the ambulance arrived, and calling the police in Little Italy about a man with a gunshot wound would have made things complicated for both of us." I paused. My father taught me to be practical. Vittorio turned my hand over in his, studying it the way old men study things they want to memorize. "Your father, Enzo Amalfi." It wasn't a question. He was a good man, one of the best I ever had. He left honorably. I always regretted that we lost touch. He didn't regret it, I said honestly. He just wanted to be a bookseller. Vittorio was quiet for a moment. Then, and look what came of it. A bookseller's daughter who saves old dons in alleys. When I finally stood to leave, Vittorio tightened his grip briefly on my hand. "Stay close," he said quietly. Not commanding, requesting. The difference was audible. "Whatever my son has done to wrong you, and I can see from your face that he has, he is not past redemption. No Vesperi has ever been past redemption. We're just slower than most to find the door." I didn't answer. I left the room with my head full and my chest doing something complicated. In the hallway, Alessio waited. We walked back downstairs without speaking. The fire in the study had burned lower. He poured something amber into a glass and set it on the desk, pushed it toward me without explanation, which I interpreted correctly as the closest he was likely to get to an apology tonight. I picked up the glass, drank. "Tell me about Benevento," I said. A dark expression moved through his face. "He's no longer a problem." "I didn't ask if he was a problem. I asked you to tell me about him. Who was he working for? Who told him to use my store as the lie?" Alessio studied me. Ferrara. Carmine Ferrara orchestrated this? The false intelligence, the destruction of my store, all of it pointing at a woman who had nothing to do with any of it, to make you reactive, to make you burn something valuable without knowing what it was. Alessio set his glass down very carefully. What do you mean, valuable? I reached into the inside pocket of my coat and produced a small envelope. Inside was a bookmark, old, blood-stained, its edges brown. On the back, in handwriting I recognized now from the note he'd sent me, were 2 columns of names. Old names. Dates. A code that had taken me 2 years to partially translate after I'd found it on my counter the morning after the alley. Your father wrote these the night I stitched him up, I said. I think, in case he didn't survive, he wanted a record. I never showed it to anyone. I barely understood what it was, but I kept it, because it had his blood on it, and he'd been alive when he left my store, and somehow that made it feel sacred. Alessio took the bookmark with both hands. He looked at it for a long time. These names, he said finally, his voice dangerously quiet. These are the men who ordered the hit on my father, 5 years ago. These are Ferrara's people. Yes, I said. He looked up. You've had this for 5 years. I've had it, and so has someone else apparently, because last month, a man I'd never seen before came into the library where I work and described this bookmark to me in detail and asked if I knew where it was. He said his employer needed it urgently. He said his employer's name was Luca Vesperi. The room went very still. Alessio's face did something I hadn't seen it do before. It didn't harden. It fractured. Just briefly. Just enough to show me something underneath that looked like betrayal mixed with grief, mixed with the particular fury of a man whose world has just rearranged itself into a shape he doesn't recognize. Luca, his underboss, his brother. How long have you known? He asked. Long enough to be careful, I said, and to come here tonight prepared for either version of this conversation. Comment below. Sarah came in with that bookmark as a weapon. She's not just surviving, she's been strategic this whole time. Did you see that coming? What do you think Luca's play is? He didn't sleep that night. I knew because neither did I. He offered me a room, one of many, in a house full of them, and I accepted not from comfort but from calculation. Leaving at midnight with that bookmark in the equation felt like walking out of a room with a lit candle and no map. The room was the color of old cream, with windows that looked out over the city. Chicago at 3 a.m. is its own creature. Amber streetlights, the distant moan of the L train, the lake somewhere beyond the buildings like a held breath. I stood at the window in borrowed clothes that were slightly too large and smelled of something I was not going to think about, and I watched the city and thought about my father. He had known the Vesperi, had served them, left them, built something clean and separate, had taught me that worlds could be adjacent without being the same, that proximity to darkness didn't make you dark, only the choices you made in it did. I was thinking about choices. I was thinking about what it meant that I'd kept that bookmark for 5 years and hadn't burned it, hadn't buried it, hadn't given it to anyone, had simply lived with it as a secret the way I lived with most things, quietly, privately, refusing to let it define me, but refusing to pretend it wasn't there. There was a knock at my door at 4 a.m. I opened it. Alessio stood in the hallway. Still in his dark shirt, sleeves now pushed up, a glass in one hand that was no longer full. He'd clearly been working, or trying to anyway. There was something loosened about him that the earlier formality had held in place. Not drunk, nothing so simple, just unguarded in the particular way that very late nights and very difficult revelations tend to produce. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not the managed kind, the actual kind." I leaned in the doorframe. "I'm listening." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that comes before something true. "I walked into your store and I destroyed everything you had built," he said, based on the word of a man I should have verified and didn't, because I was angry, and because anger is the one thing I have never learned to slow down. I have burned things in anger before. People, livelihoods. I have always been able to tell myself it was necessary. His jaw tightened. "I cannot tell myself that about you." "No," I agreed. "You can't." "I will rebuild it." Not an offer, a declaration, with the weight of a man who doesn't say things unless he means to execute them. Exactly as it was, or differently, if you prefer differently. The full collection, your choice of location, every book you can remember and more that you don't know yet. I looked at him for a long moment. "You think a bookstore fixes this?" "No," he said immediately. "Nothing fixes this. But it's where I have to start, because starting somewhere is the only alternative to doing nothing, and I find I can't do nothing." There was something unguarded in his face, something rare and brief that I suspected very few people had ever been given access to. Not apology as performance, apology as admission. Don Alessio Vesperi, Il Ombra, the shadow who had never looked back, standing in a hallway at 4 a.m. and looking back. I stepped aside. "Come in. We need to talk about Luca." We talked until dawn, not only about Luca, about everything. About Ferrara's endgame, which Alessio outlined with the crisp clarity of a man who has run scenarios professionally. About the names on the bookmark and what they meant for the balance of power. About my father and Vittorio and the strange parallel geometry of our lives, so many years spent adjacent to the same dangerous world without touching it. At some point, the conversation slowed. Outside, the city was beginning its gray pre-dawn rituals. I was sitting in the wide chair by the window with my knees drawn up, and he was on the other end of it. Not close, not far, in that particular middle distance that acknowledged the pull between us without surrendering to it. "I've thought about you," he said, "since that night. I don't offer that as a comfort. I offer it as a fact." "Why?" "Because you stood in the middle of everything I was doing to you, and you didn't break. And that is either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the most terrifying, and I haven't decided which." I turned from the window to look at him. "Maybe it's both," I said. He looked at me with those obsidian eyes, and in the gray pre-dawn light, he looked less like a weapon and more like a man, exhausted, complicated, carrying something heavier than his tailoring suggested. And I felt something I had no business feeling. The particular warmth of wanting to ease someone's weight, even when their hands were the ones that had caused your wounds. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face. That was all. His thumb grazed my cheekbone, brief and deliberate, the way you touch something you're not sure you're allowed to touch. Then his hand dropped, and we looked at each other in the growing light. "We need to deal with Luca," I said. "Yes," he said, "we do." But neither of us moved. Not yet. Luca Vesperi arrived for his customary Tuesday morning meeting at 8 sharp, because Luca had always been punctual. It was, I'd learn, one of his many performances of loyalty, the careful theater of a man who needed you to be watching his clock while missing his hands. I was not in the room when he arrived. I was behind it. in Alessio's private office, behind a door that looked like a wall, because houses like this one were built with exactly these kinds of architectures in mind. Spaces for witnesses that witnesses didn't know they occupied. I watched through the gap in the door as Luca came in. He was broader than Alessio, rougher hewn, with the kind of face that might have been handsome in another life, but had been lived in too hard. The same black hair, but cut closer. The same dark eyes, but they moved differently. They moved like they were always calculating exit routes. Alessio was at his desk. Still. The stillness from the night of the fire, but colder now, directed. "There's a problem," Alessio said, without preamble. "Someone accessed our father's medical files last month. Unauthorized. Someone looking for information about a woman who visited him 5 years ago. Someone who had reason to want that woman to disappear before she could bring what she knows directly to me." Luca's expression didn't change. That was how I knew he was guilty. An innocent man would have looked confused. Luca looked composed in the practiced way of someone who has prepared for versions of this conversation. "That's concerning," Luca said. "Who would have access to—" "You," Alessio said simply. The silence stretched. "You've known about the bookmark since Father told you. When? A month after the alley? 6 weeks? You knew that Sarah Amalfi had evidence that could put Ferrara away and untangle every operation he's had running against us for a decade. And you didn't bring it to me." "Alessio, you didn't bring it to me," Alessio continued, his voice staying level in the way that I was beginning to understand was far more dangerous than any raised tone. "Because Ferrara's been paying you. Has been paying you since before the night in the alley. The hit on our father wasn't ordered by Ferrara alone, was it, Luca? Someone inside had to clear the bodyguard schedule. Had to make sure Father was alone that night." Luca went very still. I pressed my back against the wall behind the door and breathed carefully. "You let him nearly die," Alessio said. "Our father. You arranged the circumstances of his shooting, and then you spent 5 years watching him deteriorate, and you sat at his bedside and held his hand and—" He stopped. He picked up his pen from the desk and set it down again, a small, contained gesture of a man preventing himself from doing something else entirely. "You wanted the throne," Alessio said. "You've always wanted it. And you assumed that when Father died, I'd be vulnerable enough, grieving enough, that Ferrara and you together could take what I had." Luca's composure finally fractured. Not into guilt, into anger. The kind of anger that's been fermenting for years. "You were always Father's favorite," Luca said. "Since we were children. Everything went to you. The title, the loyalty, the empire. I built half of what you have. I bled for this family. You tried to have our father killed," Alessio said. The words landed like a verdict, because they were one. Luca looked at his brother for a long moment, then at the door behind which I stood, which he couldn't see through, but which he seemed to sense. His eyes slid there with the instinct of a man who has spent his life being watched by invisible things. "You have someone listening," Luca said. "I have a witness," Alessio corrected. She already had everything I needed. This conversation was not for the evidence. It was for me. 2 of Alessio's men came into the room from the rear door. Luca looked at them, and then at his brother, and I watched his face do the terrible calculation that men in his position always have to do, whether there is any angle left, any play, any leverage. There wasn't. He knew it. He went with the men without fighting, which told me more about him than the fighting would have. He was saving himself for later. Luca Vesperi would always be saving himself for later. When they were gone, Alessio sat at his desk for a long moment with his hands flat on the surface and his head bowed, and I came out from behind the door and stood in the room with him. I didn't speak. There are things that don't want words, and the grief of being betrayed by a brother is one of them. After a while, he looked up. "Thank you," he said, "for the bookmark, for coming here, for not running." "I told you," I said. "My father taught me to walk toward the fire." Something in his face shifted. That fractured quality replaced, slowly, with something that wasn't quite peace but was adjacent to it. The look of a man who has said the worst true thing aloud and discovered that the room is still standing. Comment below. Luca's betrayal was years in the making. The throne, the resentment, the patience of it. Which hit harder for you? That he arranged the hit on his own father, or that he sat at his bedside every day knowing what he'd done? The problem with unraveling one conspiracy is that it tends to disturb the others woven around it. Within 48 hours of Luca's removal, Carmine Ferrara knew something had shifted. That was the thing about Ferrara. He was a man of extraordinary paranoia, which, in his line of work, was less a flaw than a professional tool, and his early warning systems were calibrated to detect the slightest tremor in the architecture of his plans. Luca's silence was a tremor. The bookmark's disappearance from wherever he'd expected it to be was a tremor. And Sarah Amalfi still breathing, apparently under Vesperi protection, that was a fault line. I learned all of this in a series of conversations with Alessio over those 48 hours. Conversations that happened in the kitchen at midnight, and in the car between meetings, and in the quiet of his study while the house settled around us. I was learning his rhythms, the way he thought, in networks, in contingencies, in the patient geometry of consequences. The way he moved, always aware of every room's exit points, every person's position, every window's sightline. I'd grown up adjacent to this world, but I'd never been inside it. It was, I was surprised to discover, not entirely unlike cataloging a collection of rare and dangerous books. You had to know what you were holding. You had to know which ones would burn you, and which ones, handled correctly, were simply volatile, all potential, waiting for context. Alessio was watching me in his world and making his own assessments. "You're not afraid," he said one night. We were going over the list of names from the bookmark. I'd been helping him cross-reference against what I remembered of conversations in my store, the specific books certain people had asked for, the patterns I'd noticed but never assembled into meaning. "I'm afraid," I corrected. "I just don't perform it." "Your father's daughter." "His and no one else's." He studied me with those dark eyes across the spread of documents. "Ferrara is going to come for you," he said. "Now that Luca is gone, he knows he's lost his inside access. He'll want to eliminate the evidence. He'll want to eliminate you." "I know." "You're not leaving this house until this is resolved." I raised an eyebrow. "Is that a request or an order?" "It's a fact," he said. "Frame it however you like." I chose to frame it for the moment as a request I was honoring, which is a distinction that mattered to me even if it was largely semantic. The call came 2 nights later. I was with Elena. She'd been brought to the house at my insistence because leaving her exposed on Ashland Street felt unconscionable now that Ferrara's men were beginning to move. Elena had brought her limoncello, adapted to her new circumstances with magnificent practicality, and was loudly criticizing the kitchen's espresso machine when one of Alessio's men appeared in the doorway. "Don Vesperi needs you," he said to me. Not Elena, me. I followed him to the study. Alessio was on the phone, standing at the window with his back to me, and the quality of his stillness was wrong. The kind of wrong that I'd learned in my brief time in this house meant something terrible had happened, or was about to. He hung up, turned around. "Ferrara has made a move," he said. "What kind?" "The kind that requires an answer tonight." Ferrara's men had taken Elena Sartori. No, wait. That's not right. I need to tell you what actually happened, because what actually happened was worse. They hadn't taken Elena. They had come for Elena in order to bring me out. And Elena, broad-shouldered, limoncello-carrying, three-language-swearing Elena, had apparently declined to be used as bait with some enthusiasm, because by the time Ferrara's men had finished making their communication, there were two of them who needed medical attention, and Elena was locked in a restaurant walk-in cooler on Halsted Street, furious, cold, and texting me approximately 17 times a minute. I read the texts over Alessio's shoulder. The last one read, "Tell your scary boyfriend I want a new coat if mine is ruined by this freezer. And also, I found a very good gorgonzola in here, and I intend to take it." "She's fine," I said. "For now," Alessio said. "Ferrara will try something else. He needs you off the board before this goes to anyone with the authority to act on those names. And Sera..." He stopped, said my name differently, like it cost him something. "He knows you're here." "Then we don't wait for him to come to us," I said. Alessio looked at me. "No," he agreed. "We don't." They moved on the warehouse at 11. I was not supposed to be there. That was made extremely clear to me in the 45 minutes before departure, during which Alessio gave me a detailed and frankly impressive lecture on why civilians did not accompany Vesperi operations to active confrontation sites. I listened to the entire lecture. Then I got in the second car. He saw me when we arrived at the staging point a block from the warehouse, emerging from the car while his men looked at anything except both of us. And for one moment, his face did something extraordinary. It moved through fury and protectiveness and resignation and something else, something that settled over him like a coat. And that something was, "She's here and she's not leaving." "Stay behind Nico," he said, his most trusted man. "Don't move unless I tell you to. Don't be a hero." "I'm a bookseller," I said. The heroism is metaphorical. The operation was not clean. They rarely are when the intelligence is partial and the other side has had warning. Ferrara had men in the warehouse, not many, but enough to turn the entry complicated. What followed happened in impressions. Gunfire, shouting in two languages, the smell of machine oil and damp concrete. Nico keeping me pressed against a wall, while the world in front of us reordered itself violently. And Alessio. I watched him work and understood, in a way I hadn't before, why they called him Il Ombra. Not because he hid, he didn't hide, but because he moved through the space between things with such precision that he seemed to be everywhere at once and nowhere you were looking. He was not reckless. He was not brutal for its own sake. He was, in the most disturbing possible way, professional. A man so wholly committed to his purpose that he had burned away everything extraneous and left only the thing itself. When Ferrara's men were down and the warehouse was quiet, they found Elena in a locked side room, seated on a crate, still somehow holding her coat closed over what turned out to be a truly excellent piece of gorgonzola. She looked at Alessio, looked at me, looked at Alessio again. "So," she said to me, "not now, Elena." "When?" "Later." She said something in Neapolitan that I chose not to translate. We went back to the house. The safe house, actually. A secondary location in Ukrainian village, smaller and warmer than the Gold Coast mansion. A place that felt like it was used for exactly this kind of aftermath. Candles because the electricity was wired for minimal footprint. Rain on the windows, naturally, because this story seems to run on Chicago rain as a power source. Ferrara was still out there. He hadn't been at the warehouse. Information they'd extracted with varying degrees of pleasantness suggested he'd been informed of the operation before they arrived, that he'd retreated to a secondary location, and that he was not finished. So we waited. In the candlelight, with the rain outside and the day's violence settling into us both, Alessio sat on the floor with his back against the wall and his head back and his eyes closed, and I sat beside him, close enough that our shoulders touched, and we stayed that way for a long while. "I keep thinking about the match," he said finally. I turned to look at him. "The night of the fire. I keep thinking, I lit it. I walked out, and I didn't feel anything. That's what haunts me. Not that I did it, that I felt nothing." "You felt something," I said. "You were furious. Fury is a feeling." "Fury is an absence," he said. "Everything else burns off, and you're left with this empty, airless rage that feels like clarity, but isn't. It's just destruction with good posture." I was quiet. "After the fire," he said, "I kept seeing your face. Not the burning store. Your face. The way you stood in the wreckage and told me I had the wrong woman without flinching. I told myself it was because I wasn't used to being contradicted, but that wasn't it." "No," I agreed. He opened his eyes and turned his head, and we looked at each other in the candlelight. And there was no distance between us now. Not the formal desk, not the strategic documents, not the careful middle distance of the pre-dawn window. "I was wrong," he said. "About you. About what you were. About what I was doing. And I don't have a vocabulary for that, Sarah, because I have spent my entire adult life constructing a world in which I don't have to be wrong, because being wrong in my world means people die. But I was wrong about you, and you almost—" He stopped. I put my hand over his. "I didn't," I said. "I'm here." He looked at our hands. Then he turned his palm up under mine and held on, with the careful tension of someone gripping something they're afraid of dropping. "I know what I want," he said. "I want you in my world. Not because of what you know, not because of the bookmark, not because of what your father was or what you did for mine, because you are the most—" He paused, recalibrated, chose his words the way a man who rarely explains himself chooses words, with visible effort and absolute precision. "You are the only person I have been in a room with who makes me feel like there is something in me worth not burning down. And I am aware that is a terrible reason to ask someone to stay." I leaned my head against his shoulder. He went very still. "It's not terrible," I said quietly. "It's honest. I'll take honest over theatrical any day." His arm came around me slowly, like a man performing an action he's memorized from description rather than experience, tentative, then certain. Outside, the rain hardened against the glass. Inside, we sat in the candlelight and held on, and let the night do its work. Carmine Ferrara came for us at dawn. He always had been theatrical. 4 cars, 12 men, a man who had been playing the long game for so long he'd apparently decided that when the end came, it should look like a statement. And so he arrived at the safe house in the gray light with an arsenal and the absolute certainty of a man who believed his intelligence was current. It wasn't. Alessio's men had known since 4 a.m. The house had been prepared, the windows reinforced, the exits covered. What Ferrara drove into was not an ambush exactly, but something worse. A man who had been expected and was known to be coming, and had been allowed to come, because the only way to end Carmine Ferrara was to let him believe he was ending you first. I was upstairs when it started, not hiding, positioned, which is a distinction I understood better now, after 8 days in Alessio Vesperi's orbit. There's a difference between placing yourself somewhere because you're afraid and placing yourself somewhere because it's strategic. I was at the upstairs window with a clear sightline to the street, a radio earpiece, and Nico's secondary pistol in my hand, which I was holding with the grip my father had taught me when I was 17, and which I had never expected to use seriously. The fight was loud and brief and decisive. Ferrara's men were good. Alessio's were better, not because they were more numerous or more ruthless, but because they were fighting for something specific. There is a difference between men fighting for a contract and men fighting for a dawn they believe in, and that difference shows up in how they move when things get complicated. I watched from the window, and I listened on the radio, and I held the pistol, and I breathed, and I thought, this is what it looks like. The actual thing, not the romance of it, not the aesthetics of danger, the genuine mechanical reality of a world where decisions have immediate physical weight. And I thought, I can be here, in this, not pretending it's something else, not flinching from what it is, but present in it, eyes open, both feet on the ground. My father's daughter. When the radio went quiet and Nico's voice came through, clear, professional, with the words, "Il Ombra requests your presence," I was already moving. I came downstairs. The ground floor was a ruin in miniature. Glass, overturned furniture, the sharp smell of gunpowder and plaster. Alessio's men were moving through it in the practiced way of people cleaning up after themselves, which is its own kind of theater. Alessio was in the front room. He had a cut across his cheekbone, not deep, the kind that would scar lightly and fade to almost nothing. His coat was ruined. He was looking out the shattered front window at the gray Chicago dawn with the expression of a man watching the last version of something he'd known for a long time pass out of existence. He turned when I entered. "It's done," he said. "Ferrara?" "In custody. Real custody. Federal. The names on the bookmark gave us enough to bring in people above my pay grade. He won't be arranging anything from where he's going." I exhaled. He crossed the room toward me in 3 steps and stopped just inside the distance where things become personal, and I looked at the cut on his face and the ruin of his coat and the particular exhausted realness of him at dawn after the worst night of a terrible month, and I thought, this is the man. Not Il Ombra, not the shadow, not the architect of empires and destroyer of bookstores. This, tired, honest, standing in the light. "I told my father last night," he said. "About you. About everything." A pause. "He said he already knew. He said you were the only person in his life who had ever helped him without wanting something in return, and that he'd been waiting 20 years for someone like that to walk into his son's life." My throat did something inconvenient. "He's a perceptive man," I managed. "He's dying," Alessio said. "But he'll die knowing this is resolved, knowing you're here." He reached up and touched my face with the same gentleness as the pre-dawn moment at the window, his thumb against my cheekbone, the scar-rough skin of his hand against mine. "I'm going to rebuild your store," he said. "I told you that. I meant it. But I'm also going to ask you, not tell you, ask, to be part of what happens next. In this family. In this world. Whatever you want that to look like." I thought about 31 books on a windowsill. About a screaming radiator and a borrowed cardigan. About my father's voice telling me to walk toward fire. "I have conditions," I said. "I assumed you would." "The store is mine, fully mine. My choices, my stock, my hours." "Obviously." "Elena gets a permanent security detail and a raise from whatever job she's decided she wants." His mouth curved, and this time it was not the promise of pain. It was something that looked, unmistakably, like a smile. Real. Unfamiliar to his face, perhaps, but unmistakably there. "Done. And you never make a decision about my life without asking me first. Not ever. Not for any reason." He looked at me steadily. Sarah, I burned your store without asking you, and spent every day since wishing I could unlight that match. I have no interest in repeating the experience. Good, I said. He leaned down and kissed me. Not the dramatic culmination of a long-delayed thing, but something quieter and more certain than that. The way you kiss someone when you're not doing it to prove anything, when you're not performing it for the story's arc, when you're simply doing it because you want to and you're done waiting. I kissed him back. Outside, Chicago was doing what it does best. Beginning again. The sun coming up dirty gold over the lake, the L train somewhere in the middle distance, a city made of 10,000 stories happening simultaneously, none of them paying attention to ours. Vittorio Vesperi died on a Tuesday in November, 3 weeks after the morning the warehouse burned. He died in his own bed, in his own house, with his son's hand in his. He had been told everything. Ferrara's arrest, Luca's removal, the bookmark, all of it. And he had received the information with the particular piece of a man for whom the settling of accounts is not a transaction, but a sacrament. He asked to see me the day before he died. I sat beside him the same way I had the first night, and I held his hand, and he talked about my father. Things I hadn't known, small things, the particular texture of who Enzo Amalfi had been in the years before I existed. It was a gift, quietly given. Take care of him, Vittorio said at the end. Not asking me to be careful, asking me to care for his son. The difference was significant. He takes care of himself, I said, but I'll be there. He nodded. He slept. He didn't wake up. The new bookstore opened in February. I chose a different street, not because I wanted to forget the original, but because some things deserve new architecture rather than reconstruction. A wider space this time, on the corner of a street in Little Italy that gets afternoon light in a way the old one never did. The same smell, aged leather, candle wax, ink, a locked cabinet in the back room. Inside it, behind the Calvino and the Borges and the forbidden first editions, is a blood-stained bookmark. I kept it. Of course I kept it. It's the reason any of this exists. Not the danger, not the fire, not the empire. The small, specific choice a dying man made to write down the truth, and the small, specific choice I made to preserve it. Alessio came in on the opening night and stood in the doorway the way he had stood in my door 6 weeks before, filling it, absorbing the light, being utterly impossible to ignore. "You're going to be bad for my security protocols," he said. "You're going to be terrible for my shelving organization," I said. He came inside. He closed the door behind him, and the whispering pages, new walls, new shelves, new century, began. And that, my loves, is the story of the whispering pages, and the man who burned it to the ground before learning it was the one thing in his world he should have protected. A man who moved like darkness. A woman who kept his father's blood between her pages and his empire's truth in her hands, and never once asked for anything in return, until the world gave her everything anyway. Serafina Amalfi didn't need rescuing. She needed someone to look at the fire she was already walking through and decide to walk through it with her. If this story reached into your chest and did something uncomfortable there, good. That's what dark romance is supposed to do. It's supposed to make you feel the danger and the hunger and the impossible blood-soaked beauty of love that shouldn't work, but does. If you made it this far, and you did, you glorious, bloodthirsty darling, hit subscribe, because there are more stories where this came from. More shadows, more burns, more women who were never meant to be queens, who ended up ruling the dark anyway. Drop a comment telling me, whose story do you want next? Another Vesperi? A rival empire? A woman who runs the whole operation from the very beginning. The darkness is waiting. Final engagement question. Sarah kept that bookmark for 5 years. She never asked for credit, never used it, never told a soul. What does that say about who she is? And which moment in this story hit you the hardest? Tell me below.